This is a revision video centering on extracts from Wordsworth's The Prelude, focusing in particular on Wordsworth's depiction of land. So the logical first thing to consider is the title. As we know it, The Prelude is a long poem written by Wordsworth, but it wasn't the original title of the poem. The 1850 version of the poem was published after Wordsworth's death by his widow, and it contained 14 sections or books. There were two earlier versions of the book, and they were published in 2-book and 13-book forms, but the poem is one that Wordsworth revised and constantly changed and continued throughout his life. As he was writing it, he referred to the poem as poem, title not yet fixed upon, to Coleridge, and in his letters to his sister, Dorothy Wordsworth, referred to it as poem on the growth of my own mind. So it's interesting then to think about why the lasting title may have been chosen by his widow to fit the poem. Although the work attracted little interest when it was published in 1850, it's now seen as his masterpiece. The Prelude was originally planned as an introduction to the more philosophical Recluse, which he was planning with Coleridge, which was never finished. Had it been finished, it was intended to rival Milton's epic Paradise Lost. The poem, written in blank verse and conversational, is an epic reflection on William Wordsworth's sense of himself as a poet, and also his beliefs. The reason that Wordsworth's poem is considered his masterpiece is that it fits the idea of Romanticism closely. So Romanticism then, speaking very, very broadly, because it's something that definitions disagree on as to when it occurred and what exactly defines it. But speaking generally, it was a literary, artistic and political movement originating towards the end of the 18th century and at its peak between 1800 and 1850. It followed the Age of Enlightenment and was kind of a reaction against the Industrial Revolution, where large scientific breakthroughs and rational ideas about the world developed in popularity in a way that they hadn't before. Romantics reacted against this scientific explanation and rationalisation of nature, and they sought to explore much more raw emotions and nature. They were drawn to things that they couldn't yet be explained by science, or powerful, raw examples of nature. In part, it celebrated the power of the individual and the imagination, which is evident in the Prelude. It also revived folk art and medievalism, as well as developing interest in horror, awe, and embracing the exotic and unknown. There's an emphasis on originality, and Wordsworth himself thought that poetry was the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So this real reaction against scientific rationalism and moving towards feelings and nature and not being able to explain everything. Romantics also frequently wrote about nature in all of its forms as threatening and awe-inspiring, and also as a delight and comforting. A close connection with nature was encouraged, it was seen to be healthy, and this can be seen in elements of the Prelude also. Romantics often preferred, although this is a generalisation as well, not to write in traditional forms or to subvert forms in some way so that they would be original and unique. They had liberal and social political views, and many Romantic poets expressed their views and their politics through their poems, and Wordsworth was present in revolutionary France. I recommend Les Mis, it's an excellent film. He became involved with the Republican movement there, as well as falling in love and fathering a child. A busy guy. A couple of critics had a lot to say about Wordsworth. Many literary critics throughout history have written about Wordsworth. He's very, very popular to write about very many differing opinions. De Quincey says that he has sympathy for what is really permanent in human feeling. And William Hazlitt, a Victorian critic, says he was the most original poet now living, but he was a spoiled child of disappointment as well, so kind of conflicting views from William Hazlitt. And Matthew Arnold, Victorian critic, William Hazlitt wasn't, says pieces of high merit are mingled with a mass of pieces very inferior to them, so inferior to them that it seems wonderful how the same poet should have produced both. It's the idea that Wordsworth produced a lot of mediocre poetry and then some flashes of genius that was markedly different from that in some way. The section that we've been focusing on in class is the boat stealing section, and it's the first section of the Preludes where Wordsworth describes how spirits encourage him to steal a boat. His journey begins happily, but his imagination begins to terrify him, and visions of the mountains moving freak him out, really, and he starts to kind of work himself up. This boyhood incident seems to stay with Wordsworth and allows him to understand the power and grandeur of nature and its capacity to inspire awe in humans as well. Okay, so this section of the boat steering is from the 13-book Prelude, and the final version, the 14-book, is slightly different. So this version is from the 13-book Prelude, and beginning by looking at the fact that the natural raw landscape is described. It's physically described as well, with things like the willow tree, the rocky cave, the shores, the village, the moon, the lake. It's physically described. Using a shepherd could imply rural idyll, and nature is comforting. Even the little boat has a usual home. Everything is as it should be. Nature is comforting. However, you get a slight sense of contrast, that he's a stranger to this place. He's in unfamiliar surroundings. He's a schoolboy traveller. He's alone. He's rambling. He's got no sign of direction. This is unfamiliar to him. However, nature leads him to the boat. He feels like he's been brought to the boat by unexpected chance. It was discovered thus by unexpected chance. Nature is causing him to be drawn towards the boat. I should say at this point, any notes that I'm making are not in any way exhaustive, and you should use this as a supplement to the notes you've made in class, Year 12, not as a replacement for your own notes. They'll be much more detailed in class. This is just for revision or if you missed the lesson. What's clear as well is the beauty of nature. So adjectives like shining, glittering, sparkling, they give a sense of wonder to this poem, and this kind of the idea of being influenced by the beauty of nature. The repetition of struck is very interesting. Struck the oars and struck again, and it's repeated later in the poem as well. So you get the sense of rhythm, which is also reflected when he says in cadence. And perhaps he's in tune with nature, he's in line with nature. He feels at this stage very confident, except where you get the element that he's maybe not doing what he should be, and he knows that. So, for example, troubled pleasure or acts of stealth. It suggests that he does feel a slight unease, despite being confident in his surroundings. He feels a slight unease about what he's done. It's also clear that Wordsworth takes pride in the fact that he can row. He's really trying his best, and where it says, "He proudly rowed with his best skill," he feels confident at this point, which kind of sets you up for the contrast later on in the poem, or in this extract rather, where it says in the third line down here, "I fixed a steady view upon the top of that same craggy ridge." Interesting that craggy is repeated, perhaps emphasising the power and the fact that nature can be very raw. It's not a kind of idyllic image as you've had at the start of the section. It's slightly more powerful, slightly more awe-inspiring. The idea of a crag, the idea of mountains, much more powerful. When you are rowing, you normally row backwards. To keep yourself in a straight line, your eyes must fix on a spot in order to row steadily and to row in a straight line. So where he's fixed a steady view upon the top of that same craggy ridge, that may be practical more than anything else at this stage. Interesting to note, repetition again, the bound of the horizon, mentioned twice very, very close together, I mean within kind of 10 lines or so, possibly to emphasise that nature can't be constrained, even though there's the bound of the horizon. Behind the horizon, beyond it, there's stars and the grey sky, so a sense of openness, a sense of wonder, a sense of awe. And this is kind of built upon by describing his boat as a she, so personifying the boat, which isn't unusual really, but describing the boat as elfin, so giving it a sense that it's ethereal, it's otherworldly in some way. The lake is silent as well, perhaps emphasising the isolation. However, at this stage, again, he still feels comfortable and confident. The boat goes through the water like a swan, very natural, elegant simile, until, and the contrast comes here, the bound of the horizon, a huge cliff, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. So suddenly you've got the personification, not only of the boat, but of nature itself. And again, the repetition, I struck and struck again, but this time seems less purposeful and less kind of confident, and more that there's a sense of fear building through that repetition. Later, just in the last 2 lines on this page, with measured motion like a living thing strode after me, so that kind of intimidating, threatening personification is continuing. And the fear is evident in the way that he is now writing, that he's got trembling hands, and he's been really kind of affected by this kind of boyhood incident. He begins in the last couple of lines of this section to kind of list and emphasising his desperation with the blank desertion, no familiar shapes, hourly objects, images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields. So the contrast of things that he loves about nature, he feels are missing. He feels frightened and terrified, quite frankly, of the fact that the mountains seem as if they're coming alive. So one of the traits of Romanticism is to write about imagination, to write about nature and the kind of individual experience, particularly when you're alone with nature. And so this kind of epitomises that idea. And it's an experience that stays with him as he goes through his life. To comment on structure, the blank verse and the kind of the 5 feet, it gives it a very slow and sedate rhythm for most of it. And it's got a very kind of storytelling pace, which does build tension through the contrast and through his use of language, starting with kind of the rural idyll and then moving kind of more threatening, unknown, exotic and unfamiliar language as well. So the themes then, imagination and nature as an isolated experience. I'm sure that you have lots more to add, but hopefully that will give you a start if you've missed the lesson, or if you are just looking for a starting point for your further research. I recommend Composed Upon Westminster Bridge. I love that one.